Okay, well, welcome everybody. We'll let the last few folks straggle in after they get their refreshments. This is the Science on Schema.org clusters kind of working meeting for the session. I'm Matt Jones from the UC Santa Barbara and the Data One Network, the Arctic Data Center. Happy to sort of help coordinate. There are a bunch of people in the room here that are very active participants in the Schema.org cluster, and I think maybe some new faces as well. So welcome everybody. We're really looking forward to this discussion. Today's topic is community-derived validation suites for Schema.org dataset interoperability. And what we're aiming to do is to think about the ways in which we can understand use cases for use of Schema.org and be able to better provide guidance for repositories and producers that might be trying to produce that kind of metadata for use in search and discovery systems. So the Schema.org cluster, on today's agenda, I'm going to give a really brief introduction to the cluster and its activities, and then we're going to transition to a short set of use case descriptions by Ian, Chantel, Zach, and Colin from different sort of organizational perspectives about what their use cases are for validation in Schema.org. And then, so that we're hoping will take about the first half of the session. And then the second half of the session, 45 minutes, will be kind of a discussion. We'll do hopefully a creative brainstorming sort of discussion about validation use cases. So the cluster, the Science on Schema.org cluster has been around for, I don't know, Nick, what do you think? 6 years? I forget how many years now. I've lost track. But yeah, something like that. Just pre-COVID, so maybe 6 or 7 years. It was started up by Adam Shepard and Doug Fills, who had a project called P419 that was part of EarthCube to really try to get the community to some level of agreement about how to use Schema.org to represent dataset level metadata for discovery. And the issue is that Schema.org, although a great vocabulary, is quite ambiguous with respect to like how you could fill things out. There are multiple different ways in which you could fill out a Schema.org record. And so the goal of this cluster was to provide a kind of a convention for how people would best fill out Schema.org metadata and advertise their data sets. It was really motivated by Google pushing for Schema.org metadata and for people's data sets to show up in Google dataset search, but also super useful to repositories that want to, say, become part of the Data One network or the Ocean Info Hub network or the Polar Data Search network or other types of federations of data sets. So there's two primary things that the Schema.org cluster focused on. One was how to represent data repositories in Schema.org, and then how to represent an individual data set landing page and entry in Schema.org. It's a published standard, and it's an ESEP endorsed recommendation. The citation for that's there. You can get it from Zenodo, or if you just go to scienceonschema.org, it'll take you directly to the GitHub for that. Basically, the guidelines have, you know, a pretty straightforward set of sections telling you how step by step you might go through and provide documentation for the different aspects and metadata about a data set. So each section has a diagram that kind of explains those fields. It will kind of describe the best practice or a good practice for how to do that. And sometimes it will identify when there are multiple ways of doing something. So this says, for example, that a data set generally consists of multiple data downloads, which represent the individual files that are a part of that data set. Those data downloads are about, you know, about that data set. So it basically has ways of describing each little section of the thing. It covers everything from identifiers and variables to how to reference other metadata documents, temporal and spatial coverage, the roles of people, publishers, funding, licenses, etc. Once people started filling this out, there's a pretty big push in the repository community, and now there are a lot of repositories that are providing Schema.org metadata, so it has sort of become the lingua franca of minimal metadata standards. This is Google Dataset Search showing some data sets that came out of repositories related to the geosciences area where Schema.org is being picked up by Google and being harvested to make them more discoverable and accessible. The cluster meets monthly on the fourth Thursday of every month at 2:30, and we really welcome participation. For the last year and a half or 2 years since the schema came out, their guidelines came out, we've been in kind of an implementation phase where we're focusing on helping people implement this in their repositories and less on a change phase. But we're recently now, I think, have accumulated enough real world experience with different repositories that we're starting to focus in on these use cases, and thus this session on validation. Adam Shepard, who's been, really tirelessly leading this cluster for quite some time, let us know at the last cluster meeting that he'd really like to step down. I think he's been the chair for 6 years. And so he's looking for a replacement. So after we give our presentations, I'll come back to that and we can talk a little bit about how we might handle a cluster leadership change. So the first thing we'll talk about are these cluster chair instead of chain, a typo on my part, the cluster chain nominations and who might be willing to step up. It's a relatively self-organizing cluster. Everybody does votes with their feet on the things they want to work with. So it's a pretty good group to work with. And then afterwards, we're going to have breakout groups that focus on validation rules. We've put together sort of a template for what kinds of use cases and validation rules we might have. And we're going to try to discuss what might be important to you for different use cases and how we might be able to build validation services on top of the existing ones that we've already put together for the cluster. So that's my quick intro. And any questions about the cluster while we get, I think we're going to start with Ian with a use case from Data One, and then we'll move on to other groups. And any questions while we're changing over about the cluster or what we're about? We're going to kind of dive deep into the more technical parts of this pretty quickly. So if you have any, feel free at any time to ask more general questions. Yeah. I'll let you get this up.
What these standards are for is embedding this into HTML pages that are being circulated. Is that where the rubber is hitting the road in general for what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's correct. So this is basically Google's vision for this as part of the schema.org organization is how do you embed structured metadata inside of web landing pages? A lot of the repositories in the world have more detailed metadata that doesn't fit inside of a landing page. So using JSON-LD and the schema.org vocabulary guidelines, you can kind of create a minimal metadata record that promotes discoverability primarily. That's the primary use case. As in other sessions, we've been talking about how schema.org is being extended and used in other places. And so through some of these, newer initiatives, people are trying to embed AI metadata in there as well. And so there's many different use cases for extending the records, but the primary one we've been focused on so far is search and discovery. Yeah. Okay, so everybody's going to take about 8 minutes, and I'll give you a little heads up when it's about time.
Okay, sounds good. Hi, everybody. My name is Ian Nesbitt. I'm a research software engineer at Data One. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the current going validation suite as, seen from a Data One perspective. So let's get right into it. The roadmap for where we're going to go today is I'm going to start with talking about the flow of metadata through the Data One services from the repository, the schema.org repository, through Data One's systems and then into the search index. We're going to talk about a brief overview of what Matt just touched on, which is what is science on schema.org. We're going to do a little bit of the current schema.org validation suite, the SOSO 1.2.3 shackle shape. And then we're going to go and do common issues that Data One sees with science on schema.org data from repositories, and then proposals based on those problems that we see for new validation rules. So right now, Data One has 17 schema.org repositories, as seen here. So we've been steadily sort of growing since Data One sort of adopted the SOSO rules, and a lot of repositories started going that route. The largest ones seen here are Dryad and Harvard Dataverse with, several tens of thousands of data sets. I think maybe Harvard Dataverse has over 100,000 now. I'm not really sure. But anyway, it's safe to say that it is it's a growing field. So the flow of metadata through Data One generally looks like this, where a member repository uses the Data One API, or sorry, the Data One CN uses the Data One API to grab metadata from a member repository. When there's schema.org involved with a schema.org node, it looks like this, where you have a central server at Data One hosted in a VM on, in the Data One stack, grabbing schema.org from member repositories using basically a Python scraper. And then the CN will go and grab that metadata from that central server, the so node.data1.org, through an API endpoint that will basically represent the that repository's pool of metadata. And so along this route, we have a validation step where when we see the metadata coming in, we can apply the shackle shape and see what is, what that data set looks like in terms of correctness and, completeness. That's the wrong word. I guess JSON LD adherence in a sense. So that's the first validation step. And then as some of you may know, Jeanette, who is sitting here, has been working on implementing a schema.org FAIR assessment. And so that happens looking at data that's already been absorbed into the Data One coordinating node. And so that is a further sort of assessment tool along the line from the validation step, the first one. Why do repositories choose science on schema.org? It's lightweight. There's no additional software to maintain. It ends up being searchable in a bunch of indexers. It's linked from Data One to the original data set, and it's, as I said, supported by other indexers. Challenges, it's not as descriptive as we said before. Repositories are responsible for serialization, which ends up causing adherence issues to the schema. It's relatively open-ended, so there's a lot of different ways to say the same thing. So guidelines can get misinterpreted, and not all indexers are built the same. And yeah, ours is certainly not the gold standard, I would say. So the validation gets applied prior to that ingest and detects some issues with the schema.org data before we put it into the indexer to prevent problems with that indexing step. We use the 1.2.3 shape graph, and we would like to sort of either adapt or improve that shape graph in order for us to be able to, use one that more closely aligns with our own, requirements and interests. And some other issues remain with that validation. So here is what the current validation looks like. This is also available in the linked spreadsheet that Matt was mentioning before. This is a very pared down view of it. And so you can see there's 14 rules here, some of which are required for Data One's indexer, and some of which are required only for adherence to the standard. So that's currently what it looks like. I'm going to breeze through that because I'm going to be talking about common issues that we have with it. So sometimes repositories will have multiple, they'll have their DOIs in multiple places defining multiple nodes in the add ID, which, if you know anything about JSON LD, is not really, doesn't really adhere to the principle of how those things are supposed to be defined. There's missing or invalid spatial coverage. There's unescaped HTML elements in the description or the abstract. And then there's other issues like non-UTF-8 characters and license fields that are supposed to be URLs, but which are in fact like a statement, a license statement. So just some issues that that I sort of would like to softly put forward as perhaps improvements to the current standard. So, you know, a rule about spatial coverage elements need to be sort of contained within you know, certain boundaries and be oriented a certain way. The ad ID in one node can't match the ad ID of the data set as a whole, or it as the ad ID of another node. And then other issues related to making sure that there's not unescaped HTML or injected code, and not taking any non-standard encoded characters. And then also, you know, making sure that the license field has a, you know, a URL instead of a sentence, for example. So you know, I would like to solicit contributions for this. So if, you know, we can discuss this later as well, but scienceonschema.org is where all of this is based. So if you haven't been there, I suggest checking it out. It's a GitHub repository, and all of the collaborational tools that implies are there. So the key takeaways, it's useful, but we need community input. We would like to clarify maybe the guidelines document just to make sure that people can understand and adhere to that. We need to communicate those guidelines to repository managers and engineers, so possibly having a validation tool to enforce those things, or to, you know, to communicate those things. And then I'm going to save the thoughts and comments until later because I know I'm over time now. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Ian. So if there are any questions for Ian while we get Chantel set up, then please feel free to ask them. And I ask you to just pass the microphone in that case. Okay, it looks like no immediate questions, Chantel. So I'm going to switch you to full screen mode. And yeah, I think we're ready to go. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. You guys can hear me okay and see the screen okay?
Yes.
Awesome. That works. Well, thank you so much. That was a great presentation, Ian, and I'm excited to be here. Sorry I can't be with you in person. I'm sure you're all having a great time socializing and whatnot. But yeah, my name's Chantal Berry. I'm here representing the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center, GCRC, and the Canadian Polar Data Consortium, which is formerly the Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability. I will apologize. Part of the presentation today, we're going to be looking at a couple different groups. The way that we've implemented the scienceonschema.org guidelines really was this grassroots project. And one of the ways that we wanted to highlight, and that was presented on about, I think, Peter Paul, ESIP summer meetings ago, talks about how the Canadian side has brought together about 8 or 9 repositories that operate in the Arctic to implement schema.org or create the semantic mediator and implement Science of Schema to kind of feed through the different discovery pathways. So when I talk about the Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability, the work that was done for the semantic mediator or aggregator was done under this project, but that group has now, you know, merged into CPDC. And I apologize for the acronyms in advance, but it's just easier than the word jumble that comes with all of the different groups. So CCADI architecture really is a multi-tiered system, and you know, it's where we have the partner metadata publication services as well as you know, in the different formats. You have the integration services, But you also have the semantic mediator that kind of helps bridge some of the gaps. And as Ian mentioned, schema.org is this lightweight vocabulary that was really seen to maybe solve all of the problems, which, as we know, that didn't actually happen. But there were still some troubles that occurred in the Polar community specifically. We have a lot of groups that only have maybe 2 to 3 people working for a repository at a time. And so even though we were like, oh, we can just implement so and it's going to solve the world's problems and it's all going to be great. CCADI realized that this actually wasn't the case, for the lack of a better word. So they created this metadata aggregator where we mapped metadata standards that repositories already had implemented to this so guidelines and created this mediator to kind of do those transformations itself that would feed further into the broader international initiatives such as the Polar Data Search, which I'll show in a second. And the easiest way to kind of describe how we're doing this is you have schema.org, and Matt kind of said, there's so many ways to implement schema.org. And then you have Science on Schema, which is, created for environmental sciences. It's very robust examples with multiple options for markup. But then Polder, which is the international group that really wanted to create this best practices guide on how to implement so for the Polar specific use cases, created the subset of so. So we like to kind of have this little apple tree picking, so-so's picking from schema.org, and then Polder went and picked from so from that, and just created this best practices guidance for Polar repositories, so they wouldn't have to go through all of the different so options, and really only had to pick what would be necessary to feed into a Polar data search. So Polar Data Search is built off of using Gleaner.io, which was Doug Phil's baby. And we use GraphDB but we are exploring other databases currently because we have some functionality issues with that. But Polar Data Search is based off of just the indexing of implemented schema.org, also through the CCADI semantic mediator, which feeds into Polar Data Search. So it kind of has, again, the multi-tiered system. And we're up to about 26 different repositories that have either done the schema.org so implementation or has participated in, Data One or CCADI in the past. And we index those mediators or aggregators directly and then feed it into the Polar Data Search. So it really is this decentralized system using the semantic implementation. And then one of the new developments, and why I put you all through the pain of CCADI into CPDC, is that one of the new initiatives from the newly Canadian Polar Data Consortium is to how to replicate the semantic mediator that was created under CCADI with a new repository that, has no prior knowledge. So under CCADI, you had the 8 repositories working together, building this mediation technology, and working through the validation issues and whatnot to actually feed into the program. But now, since it's kind of completed and CCADI is done with, how would we get new repositories who would be interested in, joining into what's already been done and completing this on their own? So under CPDC, we have ARF, which is the Arctic Research Foundation's implementation. So it's the complete outsider who came in to complete the Science on Schema markup and try and feed into this existing infrastructure. So the spreadsheet that's on the screen is just briefly highlighting, how the markup process, or the crosswalking process, as we like to call it, and the kind of manual process that we do for the validation. So we have our mandatory options, or optional and conditional and whatnot, and we went kind of row by row with each variable and attributes in between ISO, schema.org, and then the repositories metadata standards to see what matched and what not, and how we would deal with those misalignment of terms. So out of that, we actually developed a data standards technical report. It is now published under the Digital Governance Council of Canada. So it's describing the process of integrating the Science on Schema and Arctic Research Foundation's integration into CCADI Mediator. So you can see it's not a super lengthy process, but we did want to try and provide guidance in written form on how we did the step-by-step process. So, identifying the metadata schema of the repository, reviewing the mappings, doing the actual JSON-LD markup, how to check validation, and then the actual indexing. We also provided, our lessons learned from technical challenges from having new repository who had no prior knowledge to, you know, even really what metadata standards were, what they should be paying attention to and whatnot, to actually feeding into something like a metadata mediator with something so added in there. So next steps, as I try to not go over time, is that we are partnering with CPDC with the World Meteorological Organization, Arctic Passion, to really work on the data set interoperability and findability use case. So through the polar data search, the metadata mediator, we are in the implementation phase. Any interested repositories who want to do the markup, we're still ready to support and provide the documentation that's needed to get there. But we're busy, and you know people never stop knocking on the door. And what's next? So our next is going to be using oceanographic data use cases, so bathymetry data set specifically, and working towards semantic harmonization and mediation within there, and seeing where so data set vocabulary fits into that as well. So hopefully we are going to get the ball rolling that in the next couple of months. And we'll, I'm sure, have more lessons learned to share at the next summer meeting, hopefully in a year's time. But with that, I just want to say thank you again for letting me come share our lessons learned. And if there's any questions, comments, concerns, I'm always happy to answer. Feel free to email me at any time. But hope you guys have a great meeting otherwise. And yeah, happy to answer any questions if needed. Thank you.
Thanks, Chantal. Fantastic. Okay, so next up we have Zach Bouquet from Heliophysics. And yeah, we can see you, Zach, but not your slides yet. So
yeah, pull them up. All right. Can you hear me okay? See everything okay?
Yep.
All right, great. All right, yep. So I'm Zach Bouquet. I'm a scientific software developer at NASA's Heliophysics Digital Resource Library. And we've been working on improving and assessing FAIR for our metadata. And included in this is updating our mappings to both schema.org as well as Dataset. So our motivation for this project was revolving around NASA's 4 definitions for open science. One of particular interest here is open available science, since that pertains to FAIR. We are looking for easy improvements in FAIR that are reportable, and some benefits for us, for HDRL, improving the mapping from SPACE, which is our heliophysics specific metadata schema, to both Datasite as well as schema.org. Improves our FAIR score for our resources as assessed by existing tools such as Fuji, which is pictured here on the right, as well as our interoperability with other sciences such as ocean sciences. And all this is done without adding any additional metadata. Pictured here on the left is the current embedded schema.org JSON LD in the SPACE landing page. Specifically, it is the well-populated, gold standard SPACE record that we chose as a group. And after analyzing this JSON in terms of the group's expertise, as well as Google's Dataset metadata guidelines, we did detect a few issues that we were hoping to resolve, including the citation being included in the metadata, all the authors being within one single string. The license here is incorrect, and there's metadata in here that's not found in the actual SPACE record. So looking to improve this. This slide here is a screenshot of the results from looking up that gold standard SPACE record in Google's Dataset search. And as you can see, the incorrect license is still here, as well as that single author string. So this metadata is affecting us, and we are very interested in improving that. Now, when it comes to Datasite, ideally, the metadata should be identical to what's found in the schema.org metadata. But this slide, they're both based on the same SPACE record. But this slide right here is showing us that that's not currently the case. So there are a few mismatches between these two. So, the authors, license, keywords, All these things do not match. So we're looking to improve this as well. Now, when it comes to mapping implementation, we first began with the existing external standards and existing RDA mapping. The external standards were, as Matt touched on earlier, it's the science-on-schema.org dataset guidelines. We then formed an informal working group with international participation. So again, science-on-schema.org. We collaborated with y'all for additional input, as well as we got input from NASA heliophysics specific groups. We then implemented the mapping within Python software following best practices and incorporated it into, for schema.org, existing open source software. So this is the existing SOSO package developed by Colin Smith. And then for data site mapping, this was new open source software. Now, when it came to analyzing the results, because the Fuji tool I mentioned earlier does not have an API, we did have to develop a custom fair analysis tool, which is based on the RDA Fair Data Maturity Working Group report, which is pictured on the right. And interpretations of this report were guided by the Fuji tool and then the NASA metadata tool. We excluded any principles requiring tests on data files due to time restraints. And this is in a very early stage. We did get a few initial results to share. So here's a summary of these results. So a breakdown of the chart. Before is the average fair scores before anything was done, as they are now. After is what the scores after implementing the updated mappings, and then projected is by adding the licenses on top of that. So as you can see for schema.org, the average fair scores are projected to increase over 40%, and then for data sites over 22%. So we're very excited about these results. Some key takeaways. So improving the richness of our metadata mapped to schema.org and DataSite increases the return on our investment in metadata. We plan to use these new, more usable tools to synchronize our external metadata. So of course, embedding the correct and rich schema.org metadata in our landing pages, that's going to help with our findability. Mapping into ocean data information systems and possibly Science Explorer is going to help with our interoperability and our representation among other sciences. And then the updated mapping to DataSite is going to help make the process of drafting, updating, and minting DOIs for our space records much easier. And we are interested in exploring adding instruments to these processes. For DataSite, it does allow, there is a mapping for instrument metadata, but for schema.org, we could use some help. Might need a little bit of work on that. We are also going to build a Python tool to generate the fair scores per dataset and mass. But some challenges and needs. So each of these are some discussion points that we'd like to present to the group. So the top one here, the resulting JSON, schema.org JSON that we got whenever we piped it into DataSite's API, it resulted in an invalid JSON. So we're hoping to work with this group as well as DataSite to update the mapping that they use for that, so that it makes actual valid JSONs. We are interested in having a validation suite to check those JSONs for non-compliance as well. And we are interested in what access control terms are assessed by FAIR tools other than is accessible for free. But with that all being said, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I'd like to invite the floor for questions.
Thanks. You do have a time for a question for Zach, if anybody has one. Online as well, just unmute yourself if you'd like. Okay, well, thank you, Zach. We appreciate it. And we'll get into the discussion about validation shortly. We're going to have Colin speak now. Yeah, please go right ahead.
You mentioned a Python tool to assess that. Is that underway, or are you just thinking about that? Would you like us to give would you like to give us the repo link for us to check it out?
Yeah, so it's in, like I said, it's in very early stages. It was put together by my coworker Rebecca Ringet. She's a frequent in the SOSO meetings. If you'd like to know more about it, I can direct you to her email.
Okay, thank you.
Took me a while to find the tab. All right, Colin Smith from EDI. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. I'm Colin with the Environmental Data Initiative, and I'm going to be talking today about possibly incorporating some of the validation suite that I think that was alluded to in some of these earlier talks, and that we'll be exploring here in a little bit into the SOSO Python package. So the challenge that's kind of been implied and has been articulated somewhat is determining compliance with any one given scienceonschema.org record with the community guidelines or any sorts of use cases that we dream up. And the goal here is to implement those validation profiles into tooling like the Science on Schema or the SOSO Python package. So those of you that are not familiar with this, which is probably most of you because this is fairly new, I think it's been like about a year and a half that it's been live. The SOSO package is really a code sharing, community-driven project that's meant to simplify adoption throughout the community, reduce redundant effort in development and maintenance of conversion. The primary functionality of the package is to convert metadata standards into scienceonschema.org. And so this first code block here, sorry, it's a little bit small. The main function is this convert function. You feed it in a metadata record. You specify the conversion strategy that you want to apply to it, and then you get a SOSO record out in return. As many of you probably know, metadata records often don't contain all the information that you may want to include in a scienceonschema.org record. And so that information could be easily augmented kind of post-processing, where you reload the SOSO record into a dictionary. And then in the example in this lower code block, we're adding a URL to the dataset landing page. So we have some real basic validation in the SOSO package right now. It's currently shackle-based validation, and it's using that SOSO common version 1.2.3 that Ian is using at Data 1. It's hard-coded into this validate function. So you pass in a SOSO record, call the function, and right now you're just getting back a Boolean value. Is it true? True, it's valid. False, it's not. In the report, and any sorts of errors or warnings just show up as a printout to the console. So definitely could be improved upon, but provides some basic functionality that can be augmented going forward. So what might that be? To improve upon this, we could construct a set of shackle shapes that entertain the new sorts of validation rules that we dream up, add those to the package so that, and then incorporate those into the package, but then also incorporate them into the scienceonschema.org, kind of the official GitHub where these validation shapes currently reside. The second thing that we'd want to do is add a shape parameter to the validate function to enable user control of which shape gets called on a particular SOSO record. And then just a little tweak here to improve the reporting. Instead of just feeding that out to the console, return it in a structured format as a result. So the idea in this code block here demonstrates that validate function, pass in your SOSO record, specify the shape you want to validate against, get back the the result, is it valid or not, and then the associated report. So this is one way that this could be done. I don't know if you guys think this is good, if there are other ideas, willing to entertain those and discuss those here in a bit. But if you're interested, here are links to the documentation, the associated GitHub. And if any of you have mapped metadata standards to schema.org, which I know is like pretty much everybody at this point, I would encourage you to consider sharing it through this this code package so that others in the community can benefit from it going forward. And that's all I got.
Almost fast. We definitely have time for questions.
You just have EML mapped right now?
Yeah, EML mapped, and then actually working with Zach and Rebecca currently we're in the final stages of getting the SPACE, the heliophysics metadata standard mapped over, and that's been going really well. We're really close to having that released, but yeah, just those two for right now.
So any questions for any of our speakers? Like, we can certainly take a few minutes here to see if you think back through Ian's talk on Data One, Chantel's talk on the Canadian Polar Data Consortium, Colin and Zach on heliophysics. Also come back to any questions about the cluster and the guidelines in general that we have, if people have more open questions. So go ahead, Alicia.
Thanks to all the presenters. I'm Alicia Wood Charlson, and I'm sort of for a couple more days, part of the Data Stewardship Committee, but I also represent an online data analysis platform, and we do provide DOIs for landing pages for data sets in a Jupyter Notebook type framework. Because we're funded through Department of Energy, everything goes through Dataset. And so I was definitely curious about has Dataset been quite responsive to some of these conversations? I saw that there was I think it was in Zach's talk, there was some issues in converting between Dataset and the schema.org JSON. And I was just curious what those were and how that is going to resolve. And then I'd love to throw this at our Dataset records to see where we need to be working with OSTI, which is kind of the mediator. The Office of Science and Technical Information takes care of all the minting of DOIs, and they're very responsive. So if we could work with them to figure out what those records need to be to make sure that our DOIs are going in a SOSO compliant manner into Dataset. So closing that loop would be awesome.
Yeah. There were a number of Dataset staff who contributed to and collaborated with the social cluster early on, particularly Martin Fenner, but he has since left Dataset. So I'm not sure who there is currently aware of it, but at one point there was a pretty good effort to try to align the social guidelines that we were creating in ESIP with what they were doing in Dataset. They, of course, are dealing with a broader set of disciplines than we are. But nevertheless, I would love to hear, Zach and Colin, your reactions to that. I think you probably have a more recent experience with that than I do. So
Yeah, I know for us, the mapping that exists right now between schema.org and the Dataset, I mentioned in my talk, it doesn't quite produce valid JSONs. When we tried it recently, I'd say, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago or so, it seems like it uses, I can't quite remember the exact property, but it used a property that actually wasn't applicable to our data set. And so a lot of the actual metadata that was in the schema.org JSON was just not carrying over because it wasn't under that incorrect property. So yeah, I mean, we opened up an issue on Dataset's GitHub page. We haven't really got much response yet, but yeah, we're definitely looking to work with this group and Dataset to try and update that mapping because it'd make it a lot easier to have that pipeline fixed. It'd be much easier to make updated Dataset metadata records. We wouldn't have to develop the new tool that we had to, the new updated Dataset mapping, if that mapping were we're fixed. So, yeah.
Yep. Any other questions, comments? So I'll say that the cluster, has always envisioned these guidelines as a very loose set of recommendations so that people could come together on how to represent metadata in a way that's more consistent than is, probable if we all just read the schema.org guidelines ourselves. So the guidelines have been useful in that regard, but I think the experiences we've had both producing and then consuming these records for use in discovery systems has shown us that there are still some real challenges. One of them is that schema.org doesn't really have much to say at all about the minimum required fields for publication. And so, it really says nothing to say about it, like whether anything's required at all. Google has their rich text validator. And so Google does have a certain minimal set of fields that are required to be present in the Google Dataset search index. And a lot of people pay attention to those. Those have some perfectly sensible requirements, like that you have to have a title. They have some other requirements like that your description or abstract must be no longer than 5,000 characters. And if not, it gets rejected. So like when we harvested a lot of metadata from schema.org in Data 1, we quickly found that a lot of the data sets had 5,100 characters or 5,300, and they were getting rejected from Google. So we added to our software like changes where we just start truncating people's abstracts to make them fit the Google thing. So not great, right? So I think a lot of people weren't aware that Google was not happy with more than 5,000 characters. And I think one of the goals we have from this validation push in the cluster is to make people more aware of what some of these sometimes fairly arbitrary rules are that are out there if you want your data set to have the biggest reach that you can get. So I think we've learned through experience some of the things that we should be trying to do. Ian pointed out a bunch of the sort of challenges that we've run into when people confuse the way in which nodes are represented in JSON LD documents, and we want to make sure we have identifiers. And we've found that there are repositories that don't use sort of PID-based or persistent identifier-based systems in their repositories. So the validators, necessarily, I think, are going to differ from community to community. Like what we need to ingest data coming into Data 1, what's needed to ingest data into Google, or into, say, a heliophysics search engine or something might be very different. But nevertheless, there's probably a lot of commonalities. And so we've been envisioning that we could come up with a set of rules about what are the core things that are needed for different use cases, and then see where they overlap and help build validation tools that make it easier for communities to understand whether a given metadata record that's coming in satisfies that community's needs or not. So I think, Colin, your example of giving the SOSO tool the ability to do validation under different sort of use cases or profiles, I think you called them, is I think right in the spirit of what we were envisioning as a cluster. The cluster, like I said, works pretty much on a volunteer basis. And so the only way this work would happen is if people are enthusiastic and they want to come to the cluster meetings once a month and spend some time doing validation mappings. And maybe, like Colin, I don't know how much time it took you to build that tool, but I think it was really nice to see a repository build an open source tool for SOSO conversion that is now available for everybody to use and build upon. But that's the kind of contribution that one repository can make that's really valuable to other participants in the community. So I guess one question I have is just right off, like, validation's pretty techy, but how interesting is validation to you? And would you be willing and interested in participating in a discussion on like how to get there in terms of shared visions for validation rules for schema.org? For those of you who might be interested enough to like review something, can you raise your hand? How about to come to a monthly meeting for a few months? Okay. Our experience has been it takes about, I think, if we can get 3 committed individuals that really want to drive the process forward, a lot of other people are willing to go along and really like want it to happen. They put some time into it, but you need at least a few people that want to like adopt it as their sort of thing, right? To get it moving forward, if that makes sense. I think during our next community meeting, the next monthly call, this will be a primary topic of like, are we going to really dive into this and try to do it fully? Our hope was that during this ESIP meeting, the summer meeting, we could explore the topic a little bit more deeply and see where that lies. So if you look at the schedule, the notes document, first I wanted to point out that we have this attendance and check-in. If everybody could check in there, that would be great. I noticed that not everybody has. The pattern is still the same from all the other sessions at ESIP. So sign in if you could, that would be wonderful. But then down here in the resources section, I put in links to our session folder, and this validation use cases sheet brings you to this SOSO validation use cases sheet here. I'm going to sort of quickly review what's in this sheet and talk about this. As I mentioned, there's not really a universal set of rules that like anybody provides that says this is what you need to provide for schema.org. It's just a bunch of optional fields. So we made this what we call version 1.23 SOSO compliance rule set a long time ago when we were first trying to get a handle on things. And we recognized at the time that it was incomplete, but it was a good start. And so the first 14 rules in this spreadsheet represent just the cluster's initial attempts at defining some rules that were necessary for compatibility. So there are things like that you have the namespace of the JSON LD record correct, that you're using HTTP for that with a trailing slash on it so that all of your class names are constructed correctly, that every data set must have a linked open data identifier field in it. So these are sort of straightforward structural parts of a record. And then Ian went through and added a few more proposed things in here that were in his slides for data one, that, you know, data sets with spatial coverage, it would be really nice if they conformed to a certain bounding box convention, right? And not have, say, values greater than 360 degrees or things like that. So these are sort of a proposed set of rules, and we tried to start mapping those to a set of use cases. So if you wanted to be just sort of compliant with the minimal SOSO sort of guidelines, which of those fields would be required, which of those rules would be required and which would not? If you want to get your data set into a data one repository, into like in the data one search, which would be required, or Google Ocean Info Hub, or in this case, heliophysics. So one of the things we'd like to identify as a cluster is what are the use cases for validation that we should be trying to support? So these are a few of them. There might be others. So that's where I'd like to start the discussion is like, are there kind of community specific requirements that people have for schema.org production that aren't in this list that we should be thinking about?
I heard you get a little.
Oops.
In one of the earlier slides, one of the things that I remember was seeing variables and variable lists as a part of a data set. Just, I guess I'd like to hear a bit of people's practical experiences of like, is that getting used? Is that being ingested by Data One? Is Google looking at that? Is that level of granularity making it out to these indexers? Or is that something that SOSO compliance has specified as nice to have, but it's not really making it into any practical use cases for reasons that people have experienced through just working with this stuff? Just curious to hear anecdotes on that level of granularity.
Yeah. I haven't done an analysis of this, but my gestalt, having looked at a lot of schema.org records that we've seen coming in through data one, is that a lot of groups are not producing variable level metadata in their schema.org records, even though it is part of the guidelines. There are some that are doing it, and most of the ones that are doing it have already structured metadata systems where are generating that's fairly automatic. Like it's part of their metadata catalog and they can produce it. But for a vast majority of them, we're not seeing that level of detail. We're seeing a top level data set level descriptor and not entity level metadata about files and variables. That said, I think a lot of people have expressed an interest in doing that. And if you do go down that AI sort of pathway, then the extensions for schema.org that follow that are pretty much all built at the file level and below. They're For some reason, my brain is not working quite correctly. I have caffeine in my head, but that's not the right word. Croissant, there we go. Yeah, so the croissant metadata standard for schema.org. They propose a bunch of fields that basically better describe textual tabular files, and it's mostly at the variable attribute level and below. There are some higher level ones from schema.org as well, but like in terms of like the difference between what's in SOSO and what we're seeing and what they're mostly focused at that level. So I think to the extent that people want to start using Science on Schema.org or Schema.org as a discovery tool for finding AI-ready data sets, then people should be producing more of that kind of file level metadata. Jeanette has been working on this validation tool that we talked about to take all the data sets that we find with Schema.org and do a Schema.org check. So I don't know, Jeanette, if you have more information about, like we haven't really run it broadly yet, so I don't know if we have any summary.
We have a tool that goes through and runs a bunch of checks. It's kind of not dissimilar from the Fuji check, but it's the same thing that runs the data quality assessment that I talked about the other day. And it looks for, attribute information. But I haven't yet run it on all of our production data sets, but I've done a lot of testing. And so far what I've seen, like Matt's gestalt is correct that some nodes have variable attribute level information, but not a ton. Like it's the exception, not the rule, for sure.
Yep. So I'll cycle back to my question about use cases and say so let's assume for a minute that most people that are publishing schema.org want their data set to go into Google. So that's a reasonable use case. A lot of groups also are targeting Data One. What other use cases are there that people would like for some reason, there's a specific set of requirements that you need to sort of meet in order to have your schema.org record be useful to you? If folks are online, please feel free to unmute yourself. I will try to get the participants list up so that I can also see if somebody raises their hand, but. None? I'm curious, how many of you produce schema.org as part of a data facility or operation already? Okay, so a lot of people are already doing this. You feel like these use cases would be enough? Like if we could do validation for, I think one of the things I've struggled with is there a minimal SOSO compliance thing, or is it that just like zero fields? Like just in the absence of like the need for search, like with Data One, if we don't have a title display and identifier, then there's really not much we can do with it, right? But I don't know if that's true for SOSO. Like if somebody had titles but no identifiers, is that okay? Possibly. What's internal to you? What do you mean internal?
Oh, I mean, we have our own data repository, and when people upload, there's minimum requirements for putting it in our system, and then most of those are displayed in the SOSHA. So I don't know if.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were planning on taking, say, metadata from a SOSO record and injecting it in your system, then you'd want the SOSO minimum requirements to match yours, right?
Yeah.
Or if you're not using it that way, for export, does it matter as much?
People are reading our system to put in theirs. I mean, that's very customized and to us. So it's probably not, the two of us are interested in it, but nobody else.
The two of us. I love it.
Right?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, it might be interesting for repositories that do have their own internal standards about what minimum metadata looks like to be able to look at one another's and say, okay, this group's doing this group's doing that, and see where there's commonality. So it might actually inform some of these broader search minimums that we might have, or recommendations to have a few more of those, but I don't know. Okay. Any other general thoughts about this before we shift gears a little bit?
Yeah, Matt, thinking about data discovery, I'd love to see variable level information here. You can imagine just searching a graph of all data one data sets according to variables of measure. I think that'd be really valuable.
Yep. Yeah, and just, I mean, for the record, Data One does that already, right? So we have a attribute level search with semantic types so that you can search for all of the measurement types that have been annotated with a particular type of, say, carbon flux measurement. That only works if people actually document their attributes in their data sets and semantically type them. And the social guidelines provide enough structure that we could get that information from schema.org alone. Right now, I think all of the Data One search that's driven from that comes from other metadata standards, particularly EML has kind of a richer attribute description than the other metadata languages have. So I haven't seen anybody produce a rich metadata in schema.org for variables yet, anywhere in the, I don't know, how many do we have, Ian, total, like schema.org records have we looked at? Four, 400,000, yeah, so.
More than that.
All right, so we have a lot of Pangea records, another 300 and something thousand Pangea records, so.
And no variable level metadata coming through on the schema.org. Right. If you use the
Is there some?
if you use the SOSO package and EML is your metadata standard, you'll get that.
Yeah,
It's
excellent.
baked in. But yeah, we started publishing that a while ago, and it might just not be picked up yet, but Jeanette, maybe it is.
Yeah, it's not 0 documents with attribute information, but it's for sure the exception, not the rule.
Yeah.
And I wish, I'm excited to do the production run when I get back, so we'll get some actual numbers behind this, but
Yep.
yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah, Martin.
So what would happen if, because we are working on exactly that, trying to augment the metadata with file level metadata. So would that break our ingestion into Data One?
Would it break it if what?
When we essentially adding more metadata into the, if we have a fuller record?
No, it shouldn't break it. I think our attitude towards the schema.org metadata is we standard canonicalize the record so that we can understand the structure of it. And then we extract from that the fields that we know how to search on.
Okay.
And we put those into our index. We ignore the fields that we don't know anything about, but they're still in the schema.org record. So if somebody were to look at your schema.org record through Data One, they'd see your full record. But if they were searching, they'd only be searching the fields that we actually index. So we're slowly expanding the set of fields that we index. We have, I think there's about 500 search fields in the Data One common metadata index, which is kind of a union catalog of all the different metadata standards that we support. EML and ISO and CSDGM and all the list of them. So there's an overlap. SOSO, we aren't fully covering, we haven't fully mapped the SOSO extraction to our search index, but we're getting there. So over time, if you do have a more complete schema.org record, that will eventually improve your search in Data One as well. But we're not using everything that we can, because like Ian ran into a bunch of problems with geospatial fields that we don't have enough structure around geospatial fields coming out of schema.org to be able to reliably import all of those. So there are basically some technical problems where this validator we think is going to help us get more consistency and therefore be able to more regularly interpret what we're getting from the different repositories out there. Nick, I don't know where those are.
I just wanted to say, to go back to the variable measured, the Google Dataset search will display those.
Oh, right. I didn't,
So-
I remember seeing that too. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you, variables measured. So if you're putting so you can put your, whatever you're doing, like 8 CO2 level in water, whatever, and it shows up. So that's sort of cool.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly shift gears here for a few minutes. We are running a little behind on time. So I was planning on trying to sort of ask people to think about what their validation rules that they might like to see are, but I guess I don't think we have enough time for that. I think instead, maybe what I do is have people look at this list and think about how much more extensive this set of rules might need to be in order to be useful for search and discovery for your community. There are things like geospatial search, temporal search, and others that I think would be really helpful. But one of the things we have trouble with is like different communities represent those fields in different ways. Like, so to give a different example with temporal stuff, we get a lot of people following the social guidelines on calendar dates, but like I think Nick worked extensively on geologic time and how to represent geologic time in these records. That doesn't necessarily come through to our search index. And we could use a lot more validators that checked to make sure that people are actually following the social guidelines on geologic time than whether they are or not. So I don't know how much of a priority that is, for example, to have validation rules about geologic time in addition to calendar time. Right now, I think we're checking for an XSD date, right? Yeah. So pretty minimal check on our end, but. So like Nick, from a use case perspective, I think Magic is a little bit of a different repository in terms of its disciplinary focus than the ones that we're used to dealing with. And so like, are there use cases for validation like that geologic time that we should be thinking about making sure that we cover in these validation rules?
How are people using the validation?
I think the way we're using it is how Ian described, that we're using the validation rules as a filter on incoming data sets before we ingest them to make sure that they're compliant. And then we provide feedback to the provider that says that we can't ingest these 6 data sets because these rules were not followed, and therefore we wouldn't be able to make it searchable. And then hopefully or presumably the provider makes a change to those records or updates them, and then we try to reindex it. We try to ingest it again. So we go back and forth. Usually each group that we bring into Data One is usually a iterative discussion about how can you make your metadata better.
I mean, how I would use it is just checking our own records and making sure things change, bit rot, all that sort of thing, that we're, if something new happens, that we're still like outputting the correct format, that sort of thing. So I'd like to be able to run our data sets, especially like publish a new one, run that through a validator and just, check it for I guess it would be our standards. I mean, it would be, is there like a social, like this Gleaner.io, does it like check everything? I mean, I haven't done this, so I'm not sure.
Gleaner doesn't. We have in the SOSO repository, there's a set of validation shapes that are in there that include this version 1.2.3 shackle shape that we've been using, that Colin uses and we use. But like I said, that's the set of 14 rules. It's really pretty minimal. It doesn't really catch, like, if you think about the SOSO guidelines, there's probably like, I don't know, 150 or 200 different recommendations in there. And we don't check even a tiny fraction of those that people are following them. Like, we don't check that people are encoding their keywords or the right structures. We don't check that people are encoding their like attributes with the right semantic types, or like, there's a lot of things we could be checking in these rules that we're not. And so this is a very incomplete set that we're using right now.
And to create like a comprehensive system for that is
I think the system works already in the sense that this shackle validation approach is pretty straightforward. Like, it can be extended to support any of the rules we might want to, I think, develop.
Okay.
But as long as it's like automatable, we won't be able to say like, does this read like poetry? But
will it be understood by the machine?
We can tell whether or not Google's going to yell at there being too many characters. So.
Okay.
I just want to say that in part it's going to rely on who your audience is for the metadata. So if your audience is Google Dataset search, just following the SOSO compliance might be enough to, to get all of your data sets to clear their checks. But if you want to, if you want it to show up in data one search, the rules might be slightly different or more stringent, I guess. So yeah, it requires you to think a little bit about the audience that you're looking at.
Social.
We do have a Google shape, but I don't think it's accurate. I don't think it's accurate. I think Doug and Doug Fils and Dave Iglesias, I think, created a set of shapes back several years ago, I believe on an ESIP Funding Friday funded project to do that. But I don't think that they've really been made comprehensive. So that's kind of what this effort is to think about what those different validation use cases are and do a better job at it. Yep. Oh, right. So that's probably an important one. Did you have another thing, Alicia? Yeah.
One thing that I saw that was missing from this, but I think is part of it, and Jeanette agreed, that authorship, right? So the validation that there's an author identifier, ORCID, is kind of where most people are going. And partly that's a cultural change component too. Like, we're trying to elevate data sets to a first-class object, and that oftentimes requires people for getting credit for sharing their data. And then I don't know if you want to add funder information too, and that's probably not necessarily required, but you can also use a persistent identifier for funders now as well.
I was just gonna say that for my own work, there's a project that I'm working on where all the ocean stuff, that Ocean Hub project would be great to see. And I'm noticing here that it's all blank. I don't know if there's folks from that organization or from that initiative at ESIP or what this cluster's relationship is with that group. I know that they're relying and trying to work with some SOSA stuff. I don't know whether that's been through the ESIP cluster or auxiliary means, but that's definitely stuff that I'm interested in, is that group.
There's a good close relationship there. Doug Fils, who helped found this cluster, is doing a lot of the Ocean Info Hub implementation, working with Pierre Luigi. And so Pierre and Doug have both contributed to the cluster and to the initial development of the guidelines. Like I said, for the last year and a half or 2 years, the cluster's been pretty quiet, waiting for people to implement it. And so this is kind of a new push to move back into it. So hopefully we can get the folks from Ocean Info Hub. I invited them to come give a use case talk here, but they were otherwise occupied. So yeah, we should try to definitely get them involved as well. Yep. Okay. Well, thank you. I invite you all to come to the next SOSO cluster meeting, which will be on the ESIP calendar. I have that slide that introduces it, but then also in the notes, there's links to the cluster information. And what I wanted to turn back to for the last couple of minutes here, if I can find my slides. Nope, that's not it. Nope, that's not it. There it goes. I want to come back to this discussion of a cluster chair. So once again, I'd really like to give a round of applause, even though Adam couldn't make it today, but really a heartfelt round of applause for Adam for his dedication to making this cluster happen. So. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about how we might go about finding a cluster chair. This is, I think, a perennial problem in ESIP, is figuring out leadership changes. Everybody's busy. Like I said, getting 2 or 3 people to really commit to the validation stuff would be key to moving that forward. But we also need somebody to wrangle the masses that are going to join the cluster every month, right? So I'd like to, I think the floor is open. We could discuss what the role and responsibilities of a cluster chair are. We could either take floor nominations now or ask people to send nominations in to the cluster mailing list. And then we really haven't ever discussed a selection or a selection process. We talked with Alicia Kroll from ESIP, and they said it's pretty much up to the clusters to decide how they want to make those changes. So, but we're in need of a new cluster chair. Basically, Adam said any time from yesterday on. So like, yeah, so. First of all, thoughts or any questions about what is the role of a cluster chair in ESIP? I think from Adam's, like just watching Adam do it, I've never done it myself, but from watching Adam do it, I believe that the major responsibilities are to communicate effectively with the ESIP governing board and make sure that they're sort of abreast of what's happening. That's done through the community managers at ESIP, the staff. And then managing whatever the cluster's activities are, which is typically involves a monthly teleconference. Not always, but I think that's a typical thing that we've done. And then Adam played a big role in like basically trying to convince other people to invest their hard-earned time into making the cluster successful. So I think he was like the #1 person that like really helped get people involved and get them excited that we could do something together and have it be valuable for the whole community. I didn't ask Adam how much time it takes. I got the impression it's a few hours a month, not including any time he might invest in the other work of the cluster itself, but just to do the chairing part, I think is a few hours a month. Has anybody else been a chair of other clusters that could speak to that? Oh yeah, Alicia, could you?
So I was on the data stewardship committee chair for a couple of years, and a lot of it was, trying to figure out kind of on that monthly meeting what the community wanted to discuss, paying attention to the Slack because sometimes there's stuff that comes up. People ask questions or things that are relevant. Corey posted something about a particular Fair Squared project, and so we reached out to them, invited them to come give a talk at our session. So it's kind of just being aware of what's happening in the community that's related to your cluster, inviting external people to come talk about things that maybe be relevant to it. And then we ended up partnering with the Marine Data Cluster to work on this DMP, this data management resource, because that's kind of what needed to happen. And that was an easy way for the data stewardship kind of committee to get involved with an actionable item. So it's kind of just understanding what the next step is, and then making small progress towards achieving that would be my recommendation. So out of this discussion, if somebody has like, oh, I think this is a cool thing that's sort of the next low-hanging fruit, you could take on the cluster chair thing for, it doesn't have to be forever. It doesn't have to be an Adam level tenure. It could be a year, could be 6 months, whatever, but sort of helping usher the cluster through kind of to that next step and then find somebody to get excited about the thing after that. It's pretty lightweight in general. Again, it's how much you want to put into the actual working thing that you decide to do. But a couple of hours a month to kind of find somebody to speak or figure out, send out an agenda. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Matt, if I may.
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, hey, this is John Ralph. I'm serving as the chair of the governance committee, and I'm going to agree. It's not necessarily doing the work yourself, but it's wrestling with cats to get people to do the work and to find people who are interested in the topic, to run the meetings, make sure that there is progress, and if there is no interest, well then reacting appropriately. But if there is interest, making sure that at least something gets done, and ideally getting people to be interested enough to give presentations like this one at the meetings.
Right.
So yeah, it's not a necessarily heavy lift, but you can put as much as you want into it, with, of course, commensurate returns.
Yeah. Thank you, John. And I'll say I've been involved with a lot of ESIP clusters over the years and as a contributor, and I've always appreciated the work that the chairs do to contribute. It's, I think, a really rewarding process to get involved with ESIP and work outside of your own organization and more collaboratively and communitively. So yeah, I hope somebody's interested. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot or anything like that. So, but I would just say that we'll probably make a call. Well, maybe I'll just ask this. Should we do floor nominations, or should we just make a call for people to send nominations to the ESIP cluster mailing list for the Schema.org cluster? Like, any opinions about that? John, as part of the governing body, do you have any thoughts on like process that other clusters use?
No, I agree that it's really any way the cluster thinks is appropriate to make a decision is the best way for the cluster.
So Adam picks a successor and names.
Or Adam suggests some names, and maybe some people in the next cluster call suggest some names, and maybe the duty of the cluster this week is to talk to people and think about what to do next and who might be a good person to take over. This is a real opportunity to talk to people in person, and I'm sorry I'm not there, so I can't do that for the governance committee. But that's one of the great things about being at the meeting in person, is that you can gauge people's interest or dedication or whatever your criteria might be, and then suggest their name in the next meeting.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I think let's, any other comments from the floor about this process? Yeah, or Nick has a comment and Jeanette has a comment.
Yeah, I would just say that if you're involved and you have something you want the cluster to do, that makes it a lot more malleable, and running the meetings isn't that arduous. And if it's you're sort of growing and controlling what's happening, I don't know if you could say, hey, let's just make it a year and then we're going to do, some of the clusters I think sort of have that more formal, so you're not thinking, oh, I'm signing up forever. But I don't know if we'd want to do something like that, like, oh, I'll do this for 9 months because I'm interested in this project, and we'll sort of focus on that sort of thing. And I mean, of course, there's other things that can come up, but that's sort of a one way to think about it. Like, okay, I want to sort of run this for a shorter period of time to get this project focused on.
Yeah, I would say the social cluster has been a little different from some of the other longer standing clusters. Like data stewardship, I think is going on for a long time and has a serial set of things they do. Whereas the social cluster came together for a particular work thing, which was to come to some community consensus on this topic. And when we decide that we've done enough, we may disband. So it might only be, a little longer that we decide that there's still more community work to do in this space. It's hard to tell. So someone else, Jeanette, you had a comment?
Yeah, don't construe this is what I'm doing, but a person could nominate themselves, presumably, if they're interested. No, that's not what I did. What I did. Someone else, some other enthusiastic person could, though.
All right. So let's all talk about it this week. Please spread the word to others at ESIP that you might know have interest in this topic and couldn't make it. Let's think about who might be a good person to lead and that might be able to invest some time in it. And then let's plan to make recommendations and suggest names, suggest self-nominations for the next cluster meeting, and we'll try to make a decision then as a cluster. So I thank you for your input, and I hope you all have a great evening and enjoy the beautiful sunshine in Seattle tonight and at dinner. So thanks.